Hey, it's Craig. I just wanted to let you know that you can listen to Canadian History X early and ad-free on Amazon Music, included with Prime. For centuries, the Indigenous occupied the land that Redvers sits on today. It was primarily the home of the Assiniboine and Cree people, who followed the bison through the area and up into the present-day Moose Mountain Provincial Park area. The bison were a major food source for centuries for the Cree and Assiniboine people who lived in the area. In 1866, Walter Trail related a bison hunt that happened near Moose Mountain, stating, "We set forth in the first light of dawn across the sandy prairies that are broad and treeless and level from the banks of the Qu'Appelle and the Assiniboine rivers to the southwest, broken only by the gentle sloping of the Moose Mountains and further west the Wood Mountains. Our hunters drew as near as possible to the grazing animals without disturbing them. In the time-honored discipline of generations of plainsmen, they formed a long line, keeping abreast in self-imposed silence until so close that the beasts became restless and their solid heads began to rise here and there in the herd. At the instant they broke into a run, the captain gave the command to charge. Then, and not a second before, the riders descended upon them at full gallop, each man having an equal chance to approach and bring down a buffalo with his first shot. At the end of the first hour, all but the fastest riders have been dropped behind the fleeing buffalo, and they count 75 dead animals. Each cart carries 1.5 dead animals, and if the weather is cold, the meat is frozen. But if the weather is warm, an encampment of Indians is engaged to dry the meat for pemmican." The buffalo would soon disappear due to overhunting in Canada and United States. In the winter of 1882-83, the last great buffalo hunt in the area was conducted, ending traditions that went back long before the arrival of Europeans. In the area are mounds and medicine wheels that have been dated back to as much as 1700 years, showing there was indigenous inhabitation in the area while the Roman Empire was still around. The area would also be where Treaty 2 was signed by the Chippewa tribe, just northeast of the Moose Mountains. On July 8, 1874, the new Northwest Mounted Police left Fort Dufferin, located near Emerson, Manitoba. The force at the time was 275 strong, divided into 6 divisions labeled as A to F. In addition, there were 310 horses, 143 oxen, and 187 carts and wagons. In all, the force stretched for 2.4 kilometers as it marched. Beyond those items, there was also 2 field guns and 2 mortars, cattle, and mowing machines to make hay. Their goal was to journey through the Canadian West, what was then called the Northwest Territories. Over the course of 1,400 kilometers, in a journey that did not end until October 9, 1874, the Northwest Mounted Police dealt with sickness, starvation, terrible conditions, and frequent wrong turns. But this isn't the story about the march west by the Northwest Mounted Police, but about a small town that sprang up along the route in what is now called the Redcoat Trail. This is the story of Redvers, Saskatchewan. Long before Europeans ever arrived in what is now Canada, the area of Redvers, Saskatchewan was occupied by the Indigenous people. Since time immemorial, the area was the territory of the Assiniboine, Cree, and Sioux people. Later, as fur traders arrived, the culture of the Métis began to appear. As for the European history of Redvers, that begins in 1897 when the community was founded and the slow trickle of settlers began. At the time, there were few residents, and it took a decade before any real community really started to spring up. Those early settlers found bison skeletons along the landscape, often in a good state of preservation, having been killed by the Indigenous in hunts years and even decades previous. Redvers is named for General Sir Redvers Buller, a British Army officer and recipient of the Victoria Cross, the highest award for gallantry in the British Empire. He served as the Commander-in-Chief of the British forces in South Africa during the first months of the Boer War in 1900, and served in the Red River Expedition that was sent west by the Canadian government to quell the Red River Resistance in 1870. He had come through the area during that resistance, but never lived or visited the community that now has his name. According to legend, a surveyor had a newspaper as he was plotting out the land that would become Redvers. In the newspaper, there was a story about Redvers. The early community was mostly settled through the Iowa Canadian Colonization Company, which had bought the land from the CPR between 1902 and 1904. The first homes in the area were not made of wood, which can be in short supply in southern Saskatchewan, but they were made of sod. These homes could be warm and comfortable in the winter if you didn't mind the occasional rodent visitor, but in the heavy rains of the summer, they leaked badly. As early as 1898, the first interdenominational services were held in the sod house of Mr. and Mrs. R. Rowe, who homesteaded near the community. On August 12, 1900, a rural school district was requested for the area. The petition was signed by 13 residents who indicated 22 children would attend the school. After a lot of headaches to get through the process, the Redvers School Division was formed on August 5, 1901. Maggie Holstead was the first teacher hired for the new district, but she quit after one day citing ill health. Lawrence Keir was hired and classes resumed after a month of closure. In 1902, a new school opened sitting where the United Church now stands in the community. In November of 1901, Simon Hortoness arrived from North Dakota. He was simply on expedition, looking at horses, but he quickly found he liked what he saw, and he took up a homestead in the area and sold his farm in North Dakota. As he built up his homestead, he convinced others to come up from North Dakota. Martin Peterson and Chris Knudsen arrived in the summer of 1902, and in the summer of 1903, the first land was broken. The crops were good, up to 40 bushels per acre. With that good crop, more people started to arrive from the area, and the Dannevirke colony began to grow. By 1915, there would be 500 people in the colony. In 1902, the first station was built, and it was described as little more than a dirty, dreary, and small box car. By 1903, land buyers were coming from places such as Montreal, Minnesota, Wisconsin, London, England, and many places in Ontario. 1 year later, the first official church was organized with the Redvers Presbyterian Church, and 3 years later that congregation, which numbered about 50 people, built the first church in the community. In 1904, the community became a village. Around this same time, Dr. S. W. Arthur arrived in the area. He had graduated from Queen's University in 1903, and after a short time in Chicago, he headed west to Saskatchewan. He planned to just stop in Redvers for a brief period of time to make some money. In the end, he stayed for 4 decades and became an integral part of the community. In 1932, he was elected to the Saskatchewan legislature as an independent candidate. He always took an interest in the community and could be counted on to become a close friend of his patients, and he left in 1945 for Portage la Prairie. In 1905, an organized baseball team emerged in Redvers, playing in the Cannington Baseball League, and Redvers won the league title in 1907. From 1905 to 1909, Redvers was considered a corporation and not a village, so there was no regular monthly meetings. When special meetings were needed, a chairperson was chosen, a committee consisting of an overseer and 2 advisors followed up on decisions that were made. The first bank came into the community, the Bank of Hamilton, in 1908. It remained until 1923 when the Bank of Commerce bought it out. 7 years later, on January 4, 1909, the first council meeting of Redvers was held, beginning the municipal history of the community. Like other communities in the Canadian prairies, there was soon a rink built in 1910. Shares were sold for $25 each to help build the rink, and the curling and skating rink was incorporated. The total cost of building the first rink for the community was $2,000, with carpenters earning 30 cents per hour. Eventually in 1909, a delegation from Redvers went to Winnipeg to talk the CPR into constructing a better train station. The delegation was successful and a new train station, complete with a house and freight sheds, was built. That original station was dismantled in 1969. In 1909, a closed-in skating rink was built, but it blew down the following year. In 1911, the community had a population of about 200 people, which it would remain at until after the Second World War. In those early years, Main Street through Redvers was small, about half a kilometer long. The highest buildings were only 2 stories. The east side of the street had cement sidewalks, but the west side had wood and dirt sidewalks. People used to call the west side of the street Gumbo because of the clay mud. The community slowly began to grow and joined the modern world in 1914 when the Redvers telephone system was established. Redvers could now reach the outside world through the magic of the telephone. The telephone exchange operated out of a lean-to next to the butcher, and a woman identified as Mrs. Rowe became the first operator. For several years, the Redvers Central Telephone System was the largest rural telephone system in Saskatchewan. In 1926, a new school was built to accommodate the growing population of the school, costing $17,000 to build. The school was eventually sold to the United Church. The same year the school was built, the Redvers Homemakers Club erected the War Memorial, now called a cenotaph in town. It honored the soldiers of the community who went to war and never came home. It was built through the fundraising efforts of the women of the club. The Great Depression was an extremely difficult time for Redvers as well as Saskatchewan itself. The province was in dire need of relief due to the failing of crops, and Redvers was especially hard hit. In 1931, the community was already beginning to look at how to provide relief for residents, which included medical needs, food, clothing, farm tools and supplies, food for livestock, and repair services. Despite the best efforts of the community leaders, many farmers picked up and left the area, never to return. Things were not helped when, in 1934, the area was swarmed by grasshoppers for what seemed like months, destroying what little crops there were. Eventually, though, the Great Depression ended and better days were ahead for the community. One of the best places to visit near Redvers, just to the northwest, was possibly one of the most scenic in the province. It's Moose Mountain Provincial Park. Covering nearly 400 square kilometers, it is located only a few minutes north of Carlisle. The centerpiece of the park being Genesee Lake and its many fishing opportunities. It is also one of the oldest provincial parks in Saskatchewan. It was opened by Premier J.T.M. Anderson on July 1, 1932. The Moose Mountains were originally named Montagnais-la-Bosse from 1787 to 1821, when the area was primarily used by the Indigenous and fur traders. The name translates to the mountain of the bump or knob. In those early years, one of the more colorful characters to live in the area was a man named Captain David T.M. Powell, who was often called Skipper by locals. He lived alone in a small house on the northeast shore of the park. Interestingly, it is stated that his brother was Lord Baden-Powell, a British Army officer and the first chief scout of the Boy Scouts, as well as its founder. Whether that is true is hard to say, but it makes an interesting story. The establishment of the park as a provincial park in 1932 was done as part of a relief effort to help unemployed individuals during the Great Depression. In 1930 and 1931, 250 unemployed men were brought in, of all trades, to work on various aspects of the park. When you drive through Redvers, you will cross many different streets, and I wanted to go through the history of those streets and how they received their names. First, you have Surrey Crescent and Surrey Avenue. This is named for the Surrey River, which is found about an hour to the west. One interesting aspect of the town is the streets of Warren, Rhodes, Methuen, and Washope. Each of those roads are named for men associated with the Boer War, along with Redvers himself. General Charles Warren was not only the head of the Metro Police during the hunt for Jack the Ripper, but he served throughout the world in the Royal Engineers. Ironically, he did not get along with his superior, Sir Redvers Buller. Cecil Rhodes was the Prime Minister of the Cape Colony, what we now call South Africa, from 1890 to 1896. During the Boer War, he was instrumental in the defense of Kimberley, South Africa, during the siege. General Paul Methuen served across the British Empire in the army and during the Boer War was widely celebrated for his leadership. He was eventually promoted to Field Marshal and served during the First World War as well. General Andrew Washope served across the world with the British Army. During the Boer War, he was killed while commanding his brigade at a battle. The community of Washope is named for him. Going away from the Boer War leaders, we have Eichhorst Street. The street was named for early settlers who came to the area when Redvers was still forming. The same is true for Robin Street, also named for an early settler to the community. McBain Street was also named for John McBain's family, who arrived in the area in 1900 and lived in the community for a couple of years before building a home outside of Redvers. There are no streets named for Canadian prime ministers, but there is Eisenhower Street, named for an American general during the Second World War and President of the United States. A park in the community is also named for the Hancock family. John Hancock had come to Toronto from England to work as a gardener. He eventually came west and arrived in Redvers, where he was employed with the CPR. He quickly became an integral part of the community, serving on village council and as a caretaker of the school, the rink, and school. In 1936, a train wreck occurred near the town. Two men were riding the rails at the time looking for work. One of the men ran when the accident occurred, but the other paused to grab his satchel and was killed. In all, there were 42 cars loaded with grain, 2 of durum and 40 of hard wheat. About 20 cars were piled up in the wreck, and half a kilometer was torn up. To repair the damage, the CPR hired local farmers to use their horses and wagons to load and haul the grain out to the elevators. On April 27, 1948, the Redvers Hospital opened under the direction of Dr. L. Morin, and it was officially dedicated in November 1948. At first, the hospital was 25 beds with 4 private rooms and a nursery. It also had an operating room and, for the time, was one of the top hospitals in southeast Saskatchewan. As the community continued to boom, a new rink was built in 1950 on the west side of town. Most of the labor to build the 108 by 186-foot building came from volunteer labor. The area featured 2 sheets of curling ice, a skating surface, and 5 waiting rooms. Sadly, in 1964, the rink burned to the ground. The community was not going to just continue without a rink, though. Motions were put in place within weeks to make temporary outdoor ice. A new recreation center was then built, becoming one of the top arenas in the area. It featured a heated curling rink with 4 sheets of ice, a skating hockey surface, bleachers, and a second smaller skating ice surface for families and children. This was built through the efforts of local businesses and volunteers stepping up to make it happen. The building officially opened on February 11, 1968. In 1951, with oil development and a booming economy, the population of Redvers began to explode in size. New buildings were constructed, homes were built, and things were going well. In 1960, Redvers became a town rather than a village, and with that change, the size of council increased from 3 to 5 people. On July 17, 1956, a boy named Brian Trottier was born in Redvers, and while he moved to Val-Marie, where he grew up, the boy went on to win 6 Stanley Cups with the New York Islanders and Pittsburgh Penguins, as well as the Calder, Art Ross, Hart, Conn Smythe, and King Clancy trophies. Upon his retirement from the NHL in 1994, he was elected to the Hockey Hall of Fame in 1997. In 2017, he was named one of the 100 greatest NHL players ever. Another NHL player from Redvers is Dean Kennedy. Born on January 18, 1963, he played in the NHL from 1982 to 1995 for the LA Kings, New York Rangers, Buffalo Sabres, Winnipeg Jets, and the Edmonton Oilers. In 717 games in the NHL, he had 136 points and served as the captain of the Winnipeg Jets in 1993. 3 other people have also played an important role in both Redvers and Saskatchewan's history. Chris Sutter headed a committee of ranchers and livestock producers that helped form the Canadian Western Agribition, one of the biggest agricultural shows in Canada. Chris served as the first president and was inducted into the Saskatchewan Agricultural Hall of Fame in 1988. Jim Luthwaite was a founding organizer of the Agribition, which was first held in 1971. He served as its general manager in 1977 and as its controller from 1977 to 1981. He was inducted into the Agricultural Hall of Fame in 2001. Elaine Poirier organized many agricultural exhibitions in the area and served on several boards. She was the show and sales secretary for the Agribition for 30 years. In 2006, she was inducted into the Saskatchewan Agricultural Hall of Fame. And since those early years, Redvers has continued to grow into a prosperous community. The school population had increased from 103 in 1950-51 to 380 in 1965-66, and it currently has an enrollment of 270. A 2-room green stucco school was built, and then Yale School was brought into town to serve as a classroom. Eventually, there was a need to build a high school, which was accomplished in 1963. In 1964, a gymnasium was added to the school. There's also a healthcare center built in 1995 that caters to the medical needs of the community and the surrounding area. This facility was completely built through funding from the community. 2 years prior to the construction of the center, the Redvers and District Community Health Foundation was incorporated. The Redvers Golf and Country Club was organized in 1966 with 14 original members. The land the course sits on was donated by Howard Wright, and the course was built by volunteers. The course opened in 1970, and a new clubhouse was built that same year. The course continues to operate to this day, featuring one of the best 9-hole courses in southeastern Saskatchewan. It also features a newly built clubhouse called the Back Nine. For those who love recreation, there's the Redvers Recreational Center. There's also the swimming pool that went through a restoration in 2019, which was community funded and received the Enabling Accessibility Fund, along with other significant donations and grants. Since Redvers is located along the Redcoat Trail, the path the Northwest Mounted Police took to get to Western Canada in 1874, the decision was made to not only honor those men, but also the RCMP troops who gave their lives in service. The town chose to honor those officers with a statue of a Northwest Mounted Police officer. The statue, seen as you come into town, was created by Robert Banks, a Vancouver artist, as part of the centennial celebrations of the RCMP and Northwest Mounted Police in 1973. It rises to 16.5 feet in the air and was constructed by Ralph Berg out of Cabri. It was officially unveiled on July 26, 1998. It is right nearby to the statue that you will also find the Redvers Tourism Log Cabin. This log cabin was built in 1977 using spruce logs hauled to Redvers from the Duck Mountains in Manitoba in 1975. And within this building, there's a gift shop that sells souvenirs and local crafts. A campground is also located nearby.